The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the farmer took the stand, his weathered hands gripping the railing and his voice thick with a southern drawl as he began recounting the events leading up to the dispute. As he spoke, a soft chuckle escaped, Judge Barrett's lips causing the room to fall silent, all eyes turning to the bench as tension filled the air. The farmer paused, his eyes locking with the judge's, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. Her smile faded, replaced by a look of realization. In that charged silence, everything shifted. John Dwyer stood there, a man of 54, sun-baked and shaped by the earth, unwavering and resolute, ready to face whatever came next. His skin and hands told stories of labor that no legal brief could ever capture. For generations, his family had worked the same patch of land in South Carolina, a 150-year-old farm passed down from father to son. To him, that land wasn't just property, it was a legacy. The barn, the oak tree by the fence line, even the worn-down path his tractor rumbled over each morning, all of it held memories and meaning. He wasn't a man of many words, but when he spoke, it was with conviction, grit, and the steady voice of someone who understood the value of honest work. This case wasn't just about land, it was about survival. A large development corporation had staked a claim to a section of land that cut straight through Dwyer's property, threatening everything his family had built for generations. Citing outdated boundary filings and alleged easement rights, the development corporation pushed its claim, but John couldn't afford a team of elite lawyers. What he did have was community support, a local advocate and sheer determination to hold on to the soil his ancestors had poured their sweat and blood into. Presiding over the case was Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett, a figure praised by some for her textualist views and family values, yet criticized by others for her controversial rulings. Known for her sharp intellect and calm demeanor, on the bench, Barrett had built a reputation for decisive reasoning. But despite her prestige, she had rarely encountered a voice like Dwyer's in her courtroom, raw, unpolished, and deeply rooted in the land he fought to protect. This wasn't just a court case, it was a cultural confrontation. On one side stood a rural man, deeply rooted in tradition. On the other, a towering institution governed by procedure, precedent, and polished legal dialect. For John, the stakes were clear. It was his land, his history, and his dignity. For the court, it was a test of impartiality, respect, and whether justice truly listened to all voices equally. As the session resumed, everyone in the room could feel that this wasn't just another proceeding. Something more human, more raw, had slipped into the sterile halls of law and order. The next few hours would determine if the system was big enough to hold a small man's truth. John Dwyer nervously adjusted the microphone, leaning in and clearing his throat. "Ma'am," he began, his voice low and steady, "all I'm asking is that y'all take a real good look at what this land means to folks like us. We don't just grow corn on that soil. We raise families on it, build memories, bury our dogs. Beneath the old pecan tree, that wasn't just dirt to them, that was home." His drawl was thick but genuine, each word rolling out with plain-spoken sincerity. He wasn't performing, he was pleading. His voice, unpolished yet undeniably heartfelt, filled the courtroom with raw authenticity. Just as he paused to gather his thoughts, Judge Barrett tilted her head slightly and let out a brief chuckle. It wasn't loud, nor did it seem intended to be cruel, but in the sharp silence of the courtroom it echoed louder than a gavel's slam, the kind of chuckle someone makes when they hear something quaint or out of place. She brushed her hand against her chin as if to hide it, but it was too late. The room froze, eyes darted nervously, some jurors blinked in disbelief, and one attorney's jaw tightened. Dwyer stood still, confused and unsure if he had misspoken or misstepped for just a moment. That sinking feeling of being dismissed washed over him. He cleared his throat quietly, and for a brief moment the hurt flickered across his face. Not anger, not rage, but something far sadder. His hands gripped the edge of the stand a little tighter. "I reckon that might sound funny to folks who ain't from around where I'm from," he said, his voice softer now, steady but wounded. "But I promise you, I ain't making light of this." Judge A. Barrett's expression shifted. Her smile faded into something more neutral, more composed. She glanced down at her notes, avoiding his eyes, but the damage was already done. In that instant, every rural American watching, whether live or later through viral clips, felt the sting. It wasn't just a laugh at a man's voice. It was something deeper, a subtle dismissal that cut straight to the heart. It wasn't just a laugh at a man's voice. It was a laugh at a culture, a way of life often overlooked and caricatured. Dwyer hadn't asked for pity. He'd asked for fairness. Yet that laugh, whether intentional or not, seemed to confirm the very fears he and others like him carried, that their voices didn't belong in rooms like this. Still, he stood his ground, dignified and measured. He had come too far to let a moment of disrespect shake the truth he carried with him. By the time the courtroom lights dimmed and the day's proceedings ended, the clip had already made its way online. A junior journalist from a local affiliate had captured the exchange. John Dwyer's sincere statement, Judge Barrett's restrained but unmistakable chuckle, and the heavy silence that followed. It was first uploaded to a court transparency forum, but from there it spread like wildfire. Within hours, the internet picked it up, spinning it into 1,000 different narratives. By midnight, a hashtag had emerged and was trending. Accent Justice, Mocked in Court and Voices Matter began trending as Twitter threads dissected the moment frame by frame. John's earnest words, the slight tilt of Barrett's head, the soft chuckle, and the flicker of hurt in his eyes. TikTok creators jumped in, recreating the scene with split-screen commentary. Some donning overalls and straw hats to portray the farmer, while others wore glasses and black robes to mimic the judge. Some videos were light-hearted satire, while others were bluntly critical. "Tell me again how justice is blind," one post read, overlaid on a freeze frame of Barrett's laugh. Another screenshot was captioned, "When your zip code is enough to make you a joke." It didn't stop there. Major news outlets picked up the story, bringing in body language experts and court commentators to analyze, was it mockery, nervous laughter, or a power slip? Morning show hosts debated intent versus impact. Even if she didn't mean it maliciously, what does it say about how we treat rural voices in elite spaces? Meanwhile, conservative commentators pushed back, arguing that a single harmless chuckle was being blown out of proportion. A columnist wrote, "Let's not act like the justice system is a sitcom because of social media outrage," but those voices were quickly drowned out by public sentiment. Op-eds followed in major outlets like the New York Times with headlines like "When Justice Laughs," "The Silent Biases of the Bench," while smaller papers from Kentucky, Alabama, and Tennessee echoed the sentiment with pieces titled, "That Wasn't." Just a laugh, that was us they laughed at. In digital spaces, people began sharing their own stories. Students from rural towns recalling being mocked in city classrooms, workers ignored in corporate offices because of their accents. Even celebrities joined. In-country singer Lainey Brooks tweeted, "My granddad talked just like John Dwyer. He deserved more than a chuckle. He deserved to be heard." What began as a quiet, uncomfortable moment had evolved into a national conversation about voice, respect, class, and the hidden prejudices still pulsing through America's most powerful institutions. It wasn't just about one courtroom in South Carolina anymore. It was about everyone who'd ever been laughed at for simply being themselves, for the way they spoke, and now they saw it play out on the bench of the nation's highest court. 2 days after the courtroom clip went viral, John Dwyer finally stepped in front of a camera, not for drama, not for the spotlight, but because his neighbors asked him to share his side. The interview took place on the porch of his farmhouse, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows over the porch swing behind him. He wore a flannel shirt tucked into his jeans, the same outfit he'd worn in court. His words were slow, thoughtful, and measured. "I wasn't trying to be funny," he said plainly, his eyes squinting slightly against the sunlight. "I was just trying to be heard." There was no media coach, no teleprompter, just John speaking the same way he had in court, with honesty and the steady calm that had made the world pause. He wasn't angry, just quietly disappointed. "Folks like me, we don't expect much, just a fair listening, that's all," John said quietly. The clip aired on a regional news station that evening and was quickly shared online. But what surprised everyone, perhaps even John himself, was how deeply his message resonated. People from small towns across the country began posting videos echoing his sentiment. "My dad sounds just like him," one man from Oklahoma wrote, "and he's the smartest man I've ever met." A coal miner in West Virginia stitched the clip with tears in his eyes, saying, "We ain't dumb just 'cause we speak different." John's simple statement had become a rallying cry, not just for the rural South, but for anyone who had ever been underestimated because of how they talked. Educators and cultural critics began weighing in, highlighting how American society often equates intelligence and credibility with polished urban speech, while dismissing regional accents as backward or amusing. "Language is power," one professor tweeted. What happened in that courtroom was a moment of casual dismissal that speaks to something bigger. The most powerful reactions came from those who felt personally seen. A young waitress from Arkansas posted a TikTok saying, "I've changed the way I speak in every job interview because I was scared of being taken less seriously. Watching Mr. Dwyer, that was the first time I felt proud of how I sound." John had never asked to be a symbol, but by speaking from the heart, he became a quiet voice for millions who felt ignored, laughed at, or left behind, not by accident, but by design. 3 days after the clip had dominated headlines and social media feeds, Judge Amy Coney Barrett released a formal statement through the court's press office. It was brief but carefully worded. "My reaction during Mr. Dwyer's testimony was spontaneous, not malicious," it read. "I deeply regret that it was interpreted as dismissive. I sincerely apologize to Mr. Dwyer and to anyone who felt disrespected. By my conduct, I remain committed to upholding the dignity of every individual who steps into a courtroom, regardless of background, education, or dialect." The statement was immediately picked up by major outlets. Some applauded the apology as swift and responsible, an unusual move for a Supreme Court justice known for rarely addressing public criticism. "She owned it," one commentator noted during a legal roundtable. "That takes humility." But for others, it wasn't enough. Scholars and ethicists began debating the impact of a judge's demeanor in the courtroom. "Every word and every expression carries power," said Professor Elaine Grant of Columbia Law. "Even a chuckle, if misdirected, can undermine confidence in the process." Public opinion was sharply divided. Some felt the apology was enough to close the chapter, while others believed it had only opened a deeper one. "If it was truly unintentional," one Twitter user wrote, "why did it feel so familiar to so many of us?" Editorials poured in. One stated, "It's not about one laugh, it's about centuries of voices that were never even given a mic." Others defended Barrett, saying, "She's human. Let's not criminalize an involuntary reaction." Meanwhile, John Dwyer kept his response brief. When asked if he accepted the apology, he simply nodded and said, "I believe in moving forward, but that don't mean forgetting." In the court of public opinion, the jury was still out. In the weeks that followed, the viral courtroom moment evolved into a national conversation about a deeper, often overlooked form of bias: linguistic discrimination. While many Americans were familiar with issues of racial and gender bias in the legal system, the John Dwyer case highlighted how something as simple as an accent, a subtle marker of class, region, and upbringing, could influence perceptions of credibility and justice. Media outlets began inviting sociolinguists and legal scholars to analyze the incident. Dr. Melinda Chase, a leading expert in language and law, spoke candidly during a televised interview about the broader implications of linguistic bias in American courtrooms. During a panel discussion, Dr. Melinda Chase explained, "When someone speaks with a rural or working-class accent, studies show they're often perceived as less educated, less credible, and even less trustworthy, even when what they're saying is just as valid as someone with a standard or neutral accent." She emphasized that the courtroom, in particular, is a high-stakes environment where perception heavily influences outcomes. Jury members, judges, and even lawyers may unconsciously associate certain speech patterns with intelligence or truthfulness, creating an unspoken hierarchy of voices. Polished urban dialects are often given more weight, while regional or non-standard speakers are subtly sidelined. The John Dwyer case reignited interest in past trials where linguistic bias may have influenced judgments. One notable example from the 1990s involved a black defendant from the Deep South who was found guilty despite weak evidence, a verdict that was later overturned, shedding light on how accents can sometimes tip the scales of justice. In part, biases in the courtroom have been exposed through real-life cases. Jurors once admitted they struggled to understand and relate to a black defendant from the Deep South simply because of his accent, contributing to a wrongful conviction. That was later overturned. In another case, a Hispanic woman's testimony was dismissed as emotional and unclear, purely due to her accent, even though transcripts proved her account was both coherent and consistent. These incidents sparked calls for legal reform, with advocates suggesting that judges and jurors receive training on linguistic bias, much like existing programs for racial and gender sensitivity. Others proposed allowing expert testimony in court to explain how regional speech patterns differ, without implying dishonesty or a lack of intelligence. But perhaps the most powerful voices came from those directly impacted: rural Americans, working-class communities, and immigrants who began sharing their stories in public forums, online articles, and community meetings, highlighting how their voices had been unfairly judged for far too long. Panels across the country lit up with voices sharing their own stories, tales of being mocked in college classrooms, passed over in job interviews, or talked over in city council meetings, simply because of how they sounded. This isn't just about words, one writer noted. It's about who we consider worth listening to. The Dwyer case had forced the legal world to look inward, peeling back the layers of tradition and authority to reveal a quiet yet profound question. If justice is blind, should it not also be deaf to accent? In a system built entirely on words, the way one's voice sounds should never determine the weight of their truth. Yet for far too long, it had. For the first time in decades, that conversation was finally at the center of a courtroom. When the court reconvened 2 weeks later, the anticipation was thick, like thunderclouds gathering before a storm. Reporters crowded the courthouse steps, and supporters and skeptics alike filled the gallery. This had long since stopped being just a property dispute. It had become a symbol, a reckoning. All eyes were fixed on Judge Amy Coney Barrett as she began to read her decision. Her voice carried its usual calm authority, but this time there was something different, something almost personal. After reviewing all arguments and evidence, she began, the room holding its breath. This court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Mr. John Dwyer. The development company's claim to easement lacks merit, and the disputed parcel shall remain in the rightful ownership of the Dwyer family. A soft wave of murmurs swept through the gallery. John sat perfectly still, eyes wide, lips pressed into a thin line, as if any movement might shatter the moment. But Barrett wasn't finished. "There is more to justice," she continued, her voice steady and resolute, "than rules and records. There is dignity. There is respect. Every individual, regardless of education, dialect, or class, deserves to be heard and treated with equal seriousness. In this court, voice must never be a barrier to fairness." It was more than just a ruling. It was a reckoning. To some, her words felt like redemption, a gesture of recognition not only for John Dwyer but for the millions he had come to represent. To others, it felt like a call to responsibility, an acknowledgement that the courtroom must evolve alongside the nation it serves. As reporters rushed to capture reactions outside the courthouse, John remained quiet. When asked how he felt, he simply said, "I came to save my farm. I didn't expect to find my voice." And he did save it. The land stayed in his family, the fence line untouched. But more than that, something far larger shifted that day. A farmer had walked into the highest chambers of justice and left with more than just a verdict. He left with proof that truth, no matter how it's spoken, still has power. The day after Judge Barrett's ruling in favor of John Dwyer, headlines across the nation read like a redemption arc in real time. Barrett backs the farmer, voice of the people heard in court, from laughter to legacy. The ruling marked a profound shift, not just in the courtroom but in the court of public opinion. For many, the decision was a welcome surprise. Thousands took to social media to express their support for both the verdict and the judge's remarks on dignity and equality. "She listened, she learned, she did the right thing," read one viral post. Supporters praised her for showing humility and growth in a setting where egos often prevail. But not everyone was convinced. Skeptics pointed out that the ruling came after intense public scrutiny. Was it justice or damage control? Asked an editorial in a major publication. Others worried that the apology and verdict were too neatly tied together, suggesting that the court had been swayed by optics rather than law. When rulings follow outrage, one law professor cautioned, we must question whether justice is being served or merely perceived. We must still ask whether they follow precedent, yet the broader impact was undeniable. Law schools began hosting urgent roundtables on linguistic bias and classism in legal spaces. "For years we've taught students to argue like Harvard lawyers," one dean remarked, "but maybe it's time we taught them to listen like humans." Judicial training programs quietly circulated memos suggesting new modules on cultural sensitivity, rural outreach, and the hidden weight of body language in courtrooms. The American Bar Association issued a public recommendation urging all judges to complete annual awareness training focused on unconscious bias, including those related to language, accent, and socioeconomic background. What was once considered a soft skill was now being recognized as essential judicial competency. The Dwyer case reignited debates around the broader question of judicial neutrality. Can a judge truly be impartial if they're not actively aware of their own cultural blind spots? Should judges be held more accountable for nonverbal cues and public behavior? Amidst these discussions, one thing was clear: the Dwyer case had sparked a cultural shift, forcing the justice system to reckon with biases long left unspoken. The justice system had been forced to confront a long-ignored truth, that fairness isn't just about hearing both sides, it's about truly listening, no matter the voice in which the truth is spoken. The morning after the final ruling, John Dwyer stood at the edge of his field, watching the fog lift from the rows of corn like a slow exhale. There were no press teams or polished statements, no podiums or microphones, just him, the wind, and the land he had fought so hard to keep. "All I ever wanted," he said quietly to the local reporter who had come to visit him again, "was to be taken seriously. That's it." His voice cracked slightly, not from weakness but from the weight of the past few weeks. "I ain't a fancy speaker. I don't know Latin law words or how to twist things to sound clever, but I know what's right. I know when someone's not listening, and I know what it feels like when they finally do." The camera lingered on his face for a long moment. Stoic, weathered, tired, but proud. In the days that followed, life returned to a kind of normal in his town. Headlines moved on. The internet found its next obsession, but something had shifted, subtly but unmistakably. In courtrooms, classrooms, and corporate offices, people started listening a little more carefully to voices they might have brushed off before. In homes across rural America, people sat a little straighter when they spoke, not because they had changed, but because they had seen someone like them stand tall in the highest halls of justice and be heard. The narrator's voice returned, soft but steady, as if speaking directly to the viewer. Dignity isn't measured by how eloquent you are. Justice doesn't depend on the polish of your words. Sometimes it shows up in dusty boots, calloused hands, and a voice the system wasn't ready to hear. True, justice doesn't laugh when it should be listening, because injustice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a quiet laugh in the wrong place. The screen faded to black, the final words etched in silence. No music, no flash, just a quote glowing against the darkness. Injustice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a quiet laugh in the wrong place. Then silence, and the understanding that if justice is to mean anything at all, it must make room for every voice.